Well, welcome to week 5, Marriage and Divorce, part of the 12-part series of Redeeming Marriage, and it's glad to have you with you. My name is Steve Wiggum. This is where we've been so far in the study. If you've been following along, we're in week 5, Marriage and Divorce. We have been through some of the great doctrines of the faith. God, creation, and the institution of marriage was the first conversation we had. Marriage and the gospel. We talked about how the gospel informs our marriages, the Great Commission, and sanctification just last week. Today, it's about another big part of Christian teaching, and that has to do with what do we do with divorce. So let's just jump right in. First of all, joy is if you looked around especially in the American culture, we're seeing it also in other cultures as well, that divorce is becoming the new normal. Divorce rates are as high as we've ever seen them, and it's been really kind of unsettling of what's causing it. And it's very easy for us just to lump it up into one big huge ball and say that all divorce is being caused by one thing, and that's just the actual lack of any kind of integrity when it comes to our social mores and morality. And of course, if you look out in the popular media today, you see all kinds of things that are going on that has to do with a redefinition of what true marriage should be like, or what human sexuality should be like, and it's really creating a lot of stress and actually it is creating problems for our marriages. Our marriages are becoming less stable because of the influences. That's part of it. But for us just to leave it there would be, I think, an incomplete analysis. We're seeing other things that seem to be actually pulling on our marriages a bit more, that actually a bit as well, not more, but just as well, and we must take into consideration. One of the things that really is driving a lot of the rise in divorces is that women now have prospects. Back just a few generations ago, women were pretty much the collateral of their husbands, and they didn't have a whole lot of choice but to be married in order to be able to be safe and secure and have any kind of a meaningful future. And so now that women are able to support themselves, own their own property, vote, all these great things that have happened because of the women's movements over the last 150 years, has also given them options, and has caused them to also to say, I don't have to be in a miserable marriage any longer. And there were many women in previous generations who just endured their relationships because of the need to be married in order to have any sense of any kind of security or future. And that's problematic. We also see the same thing happening in other cultures where divorce is still highly frowned upon. How many women are just living miserable lives inside of marriages? But in the West, we're seeing that because women are now available, have a lot of options available to them for life choices, this is creating opportunity for them to say, this, I don't have to endure this much longer. This is driving it a bit. And it's important for us to understand. It's not that we should not have prospects for women. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's a necessary thing. It's really the more Christian thing, is to make sure that women have that ability to be able to navigate their futures on their own terms. But we have to realize it does come with an unintended consequence, where it is driving some of the divorce rates up. Another thing that's really interesting that I've noticed in some things I have been reading and research is that the new idea of marrying my soulmate is not necessarily a thing that has been around for generations past. It's a new idea where we actually marry the person who we just think is our soulmate. This puts a lot of pressure on the marriage, because the soulmate idea is this very highly romanticized vision of who this person can be for me, and the total fulfillment of every desire and need I have in my life actually can be met in my mate. This sometimes can create very high and unrealistic aspirations for the marriage, and leads to a lot of dissatisfaction very quickly. And some people just jump from marriage to marriage looking for their soulmate. And when they run into problems with their current marriage, they start to think, maybe this isn't my soulmate, maybe I need to go find that person. And that leads to broken marriages and divorce. Another one also is the revaluation of sex. It has become much more important to the human experience. We see that, of course, in our popular culture. We see a lot of things in our movies and our books that really celebrate human sexuality. It's much more available. You can get a lot of sexually stimulating material just right off the internet these days, and it's in our movie theaters, it's in our bookstores, it's everywhere you can actually be. And also, even with the advent of things like Cialis and Viagra, have created a new valuation of sex that should that actually makes it much more important. And when sex starts to flounder in a relationship, actually the relationship becomes a little bit unstable. But not only sex within the marriage, but also sex that's available outside of marriage is much more prevalent. And this creates another added level of stress on marriages. Another thing is actually, which is something we have never really experienced before, is just what we call choice overload. In a lot of generations in the past, there were just few options for who your mate was going to be. It's usually, most people marry somebody from their hometown. Just about 2 or 3 generations ago, that was just pretty much the norm. Very few people actually marry somebody from afar. But today, it's a lot different. And with all the social media options that are available to young people today, they have an incredible amount of people that they can actually date, and they can be from all over the world, and they can get in touch with them through things like eHarmony and also even social apps like Tinder and those kinds of things are just creating all kinds of choice overload problems for them. One thing we found out about humans is that when we have lots of choices, it's really difficult for us to be very decisive about what we want to do. It actually can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction having too much choice. And there's been a lot of research on that. When we are given too many choices, many times what we end up choosing, we feel like we're settling because we don't know if we've made the right choice, because there's so many choices to make, so many options, that when we do, we settle and become a little bit more dissatisfied quickly, which can be very problematic in a marriage. Did I marry the right person? Did I give myself enough time to really look at all the possibilities? These kinds of thoughts can be very damaging to a young, early marriage. And there's also, we've noticed that there's less societal pressure to stay married. We have come into a point where it's not nearly as problematic for your social standing that you have been divorced. In previous generations, it was very much frowned upon. In our current generation, we're seeing that it's divorce is should be expected, and when we're dealing with it much better, working with divorced people and accepting that as a societal norm now. And because of that, has actually increased the attractiveness, or at least as a possibility of being able just to get out of a marriage through divorce and not hold on to it so heavily. And so that leads us to, what does the church do? The best thing for us to understand when it comes to the Christian doctrine concerning divorce, we'll look at it very much in its most denotive way. We'll look at what the Bible tells us directly, and we'll look at some church history. But one thing we've noticed is that there are really 2 major reasons that divorce is actually accepted in a New Testament context, and that's adultery and abandonment are the 2 things. But we also know there are other reasons for divorce that can be very challenging. The safety of the wife or children, or those kinds of things, that when it's highly abusive, and it can be abusive even the opposite direction, where men are actually at risk. These things are very important, and the church needs to be very sensitive to these things. But the 2 things that really are drawn out in Scripture that we can look at with very precise, through a precise lens, is the idea that when adultery is present in a marriage, or if a spouse abandons the other spouse, these things are very much allowed. Here's an interesting passage of Scripture from Matthew. It's good for us to know exactly what the Bible says, so I'm going to read this to you. This is out of Matthew 19. This is actually about adultery, when Jesus is actually questioned by the Pharisees about what adultery is all about, when it's available, when it's important, what are the laws concerning adultery. And this is what happened. One day, the Pharisees were badgering Jesus. "Is it legal for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?" He answered, "Haven't you read in your Bible that the Creator originally made man and woman for each other, male and female? And because of this, man leaves father and mother and is firmly bonded to his wife, becoming one flesh, no longer 2 bodies, but one. Because God created this organic union of the 2 sexes, no one should desecrate his art by cutting them apart." That's a very rich passage. He's saying, listen, in the very beginning of this thing, God really wanted a marriage to be a very unified thing, and they become one flesh. And God created this organic union, and anyone who desecrates his original plan or his art, which I love that translation from the Message, really is actually going against the very thing that God had designed. Well, the passage goes on further. They shot back in rebuttal. This is the Pharisees. If that's so, why did Moses give instructions for divorce papers and divorce procedures? Jesus said, Moses provided for divorce as a concession to your hard-heartedness, but it is not part of God's original plan. I'm holding you to the original plan and holding you liable for adultery if you divorce your unfaithful wife and then marry someone else. I make an exception in cases where the spouse has committed adultery. Here's where Jesus says, listen, any other reasons because of your hard-heartedness, which is a fantastic term. What does it mean to have a hard heart? It's beyond just getting some kind of arterial sclerosis or a heart attack. The hard-heartedness is actually when you become, your heart is just blocked to another person. And that's a fascinating and beautiful way of describing just the high level of selfishness that we actually can breed in our own hearts. If you think about many of the reasons why adultery does occur, it's usually a selfishness that's all part of it. And he says, for those exceptions, that's an exception where if someone has really broken that bond of faith between the couple, then he says, I make an exception case where the spouse has committed adultery. Jesus makes it very clear. But still, it seems to be very restricting. He says, what else? I mean, there's so many other things. What if you don't like the person or you just don't get along? This is what in the next part of this passage, this is exactly what the disciples said. And Jesus says disciples, these weren't the Pharisees, these are the disciples objecting. They said, if those are the terms of marriage, we're stuck. Why get married? But Jesus said, not everyone is mature enough to live a married life. It requires a certain aptitude and grace. Marriage isn't for everyone. Some from the birth seemingly never give marriage a thought. Others never get asked or accepted. And some decide not to get married for kingdom reasons. But if you're capable of growing into the largeness of marriage, do it. That is what Jesus says. Yes, it is a difficult thing. And for you who are in marriages that are just really kind of struggling, I've been in a marriage that has really struggled, you know this idea of the largeness of marriage and how difficult it is for just mere humans to be able to fill those kinds of shoes. But adultery is, from this passage, Jesus tells us that adultery is a reason for divorce. Abandonment, we get that idea from 1 Corinthians 7, verses 15 and 16. And this is what that passage says. On the other hand, if the unbelieving spouse walks out, you've got to let him or her go. You don't have to hold on desperately. God has called us to make the best of it, and peacefully as we can. You never know, wife. The way you handle this might bring your husband not only back to you, but to God. You never know, husband. The way you handle this might bring your wife not only back to you, but to God. Powerful passage. And he says that we can actually use a spouse's abandonment as a way of reaching out to them by just letting them go. And this is sometimes very hard. If we have a spouse that does abandon another, it's a tough thing to deal with. We want to force it back together, but we're basically seeing that Paul is telling us in the book of 1 Corinthians, there's just got to be a better way of handling it, and this is exactly what the best way is for a Christian, is to let them go, especially if they're unbelieving, and that's an important passage to meditate on. So now you can see exactly why those two big ideas, adultery and abandonment, are part of the reason that are allowed for divorce in many of the Christian traditions. And of course, as you get deeper into things like abuse, those are very complicated areas. Those can be definitely considered as something being worthy of consideration for divorce. If you're considering divorce, if you're in a situation now or in a marriage that seems to be highly troubled, the best thing to do, of course, is to seek out counseling. It's hard for us to be objective about each other, and don't ever look at counseling as being a negative thing. Find a good, competent counselor who's highly trained. This is a very specific field. There are a lot of people who feel like they know things about human psychology, and they mix it in with a lot of biblical theology that they may not really understand at all. Make sure you get with a good therapist who truly understands what this is all about, have done the necessary training. It's a difficult area of counseling, so just be very careful with that, but make sure if you are considering divorce, it is worth it. The reason why, first of all, is that divorce is not what God wants for us. I mean, that is definitely a lesser reality than for a married couple to stick it out. And we find out, like we've talked already before, that many times the reason why divorce does come about is that we are really we're really, um, we're really concerned about our need love versus the gift love. Need love is that love that looks for benefits as it gives out, graces to others. Gift love is that agape love we talked about in previous sessions, that is truly modeled by Christ. And a lot of the need love that we see in the world is that, what am I getting out of this? And I will love you as long as I'm being satisfied. Gift love is, I'm going to love you just because I'm going to love you because it's the right thing to do. That's a gift love. And a lot of times you see a lot of the stresses in divorce, we have slipped into need love unbeknownst to ourselves. And we have lost the gift love. Another thing that is really kind of aggravating our marriages, that's creating a pathway to divorce, is that it goes back to John Gottman's Four Horsemen we've talked about before. There's a high level of criticism happening in the marriage, where we're critical of each other. We're not just complaining about instances, we're actually criticizing our partner for their character flaws or whatever it is. Contempt is when I start feeling superior to my partner in any way, and I hold them in contempt. Another one is defensiveness, is that anytime that there is a problem, I just become defensive. Oh, you're just always attacking me, those kinds of comments. And also stonewalling, where I just shut down. If there's any kind of issues or any kind of things we need to deal with in the marriage, I start stonewalling. This is a very more common in men than women, or stonewalling is we just shut up and leave because we're overwhelmed, as John Gottman calls it, flooding. We've just been flooded with too much and we just can't deal with it, so we just walk away. When we start seeing these things in it, it's easy for us to start having thoughts of divorce, because how can I get outside of this pain? You'll also notice when people are considering divorce, they'll start rewriting their history. So as you talk to friends who may be actually at odds with each other in their marriage and have struggling, you'll find out that as they think about the history of their marriage, they'll start talking about it in more negative terms. They will reframe even the wedding, the honeymoon, and just look at the negative aspects all the way through the first child, whatever, and they just reframe all their information in their head in a negative light. And you can tell a lot about a couple when they start rewriting history for the positive. That means that marriage is probably in pretty good shape. They look back with a lot of affection to their history. This is a telltale sign for a lot of counselors when they start seeing this happening. It gives them a key and a clue to where the state of that marriage is. Let me tell you a little bit about our history. Is that it's not necessarily a pure exact representation of what's been out there, and a lot of times our history is being rewritten. One thing that's been really fascinating over the last few years is a lot of the science that's gone into our memories. We have faulty memories. When we recall information from our brain actually takes that information that it is recalling and it packs it with other information that it thinks is relevant. We actually rewrite history every time we actually try to think of a past instance. And this is what makes it very difficult. And a classic example, this picture on the slide is actually, of course, of John F. Kennedy, that fateful day in November of 1963 when he was shot in Dallas. There was a woman on the grassy knoll that the Zapruder film actually shot. Her name was Jean Hill, the woman in red, and she became an eyewitness to the occurrence. But what was really fascinating about her story is that over the next 20 to 30 years, as she was interviewed and people talked to her, her story kept getting embellished. And it wasn't because she was trying to be deceitful. It just really shows a pattern of how we do memory recall as individuals. We recall memories and we repackage them with information and ideals and thoughts and current biases and prejudices that we have, and we recall things in the way that we want to frame them. She did the same thing. She started hearing information. Her first few interviews, she said one thing, and then as she learned about a possible conspiracy theory and all these other things, she actually added some of that information to her story that wasn't there in the present. This is why a lot of courts are now having a rough time taking eyewitness accounts as being serious evidence. They've been able to refute a lot of eyewitness accounts and people who actually were eyewitnesses in a crime because they're faulty memories. They only remember what they want to remember, and a lot of things get added to their memory as they get more exposed to more data. They'll talk about a gun being present, and all of a sudden they know exactly what kind of gun it was, weeks after the event. That has just been planted because someone mentioned it in part of the trial that there was a certain type of gun that was present, and all of a sudden they are very convinced in the future that that was the gun that was being held by the person who was perpetuating the crime. These things are happening. Our memories are being formed. And this really is important for us as we deal with each other, that if you're having a lot of negative thoughts about the past of your relationship, it could very well be that you're reframing them negatively. And the reason why you reframe them negatively is because you have a current, either just a dissatisfaction with the relationship. And the more you dwell on it, the more negative that it becomes, the more you rewrite your own history. And this creates problems. Another thing you also see is that rationalization starts to take into effect. We rationalize everything. Matter of fact, this is hard for us to understand, is that we could be doing something terribly bad, very selfish, and we can rationalize it as being very helpful or very selfless. Rationalization is a tool that we use in order to be able to deal with some of our own choices, and we don't really easily understand our own motives. We bury our motives behind a lot of rationalization. This is why when you talk to couples, they can just be so dogmatic about they're the injured party. And many times they have rationalized some of the things that they've done. I've tried to do all these things and he's never or she's never, and they just go back and forth and they just completely rationalize away what's really happening in the real story, and it creates all kinds of problems. And this leads to an inevitable road toward divorce when it becomes more and more acute. So be aware of that. If you're actually having those kinds of thoughts and you're thinking you're the injured party, make sure we're not just over-rationalizing, and that's a tough thing. This is why a skilled counselor can help you be able to pull through some of these rationalizations and see something a little bit more objective. Another thing that becomes really a problem for our marriages is the idea of greener pastures. You meet someone else who just gets you, just understands you, or he makes me feel like a woman, or she makes me feel more like a man. She appreciates me. These are thoughts that come into our heads, and they happen all the time. You walk into a restaurant and there's a beautiful woman if you're a guy, and you see her and you say, wow, she is very beautiful. And if you allow that to dwell, you say, wow, I wonder if life would be better with somebody like that than with my wife. Women, the same thing. You're having a rough thing, and all of a sudden a rough day at work or something, and some guy comes and just totally understands, listens, and just gets you, and it's easy just to get completely mesmerized by this. Well, what's really going on when you're having those greener pastures is that there's this thing in our brains that's happening. And for you to understand it will help you deal with it a little bit more objectively, is that when you see something that actually stimulates you or arouses, like if you're a guy and you see a beautiful woman, you get this idea of arousal that happens. This is actually dopamine in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter, it's a chemical that just really just floods the brain with a lot of great feelings, and that rush. That's when you get the warmth on your skin, the heart palpitations, sometimes goose flesh, all kinds of neat things. Pupil dilation. These things all happen when you're seeing things that arouse you. This is all dopamine, just kind of sending your body into a nice flood of new feelings. Same thing happens, women, when you see a guy who just starts really paying attention to you and really gets you. You have this rush of dopamine. And it's really a powerful thing. We think it's real. We think it's true love. As a matter of fact, I love that song by the Righteous Brothers, the famous one, that you've lost that loving feeling and it's gone, gone, gone. It's a powerful song. But what they're really singing about, if you think about it, is they're thinking about dopamine. So I've changed the words to you've lost that rush of dopamine and it's gone, gone, gone. The reason why that's important for us to understand is that we actually, as we go through a dopamine rush, we actually become less and less sensitive to it. Matter of fact, the term that's used a lot by scientists is hedonic adaptation. Hedonic means pleasure, adaptation, we adapt to our new situations. Dopamine actually becomes less and less effective over time. As a matter of fact, the dopamine rush you get off of that first flush of arousal from someone else usually takes about 12 to 18 months before it completely flatlines on you. You don't have the dopamine rush. What sustains a relationship after that is actually a rush of oxytocin, which is what's called a cuddle hormone by many psychologists, that actually brings in a lot of attraction, a lot of feelings of closeness and warmth and safety, that is the oxytocin kicking in. And so as the relationship matures, the dopamine dies off. You get that like you lose that rush of dopamine, but oxytocin takes an effect. We'll be talking more about that in future sessions. But this is what's really going on. So the fact that you're incredibly aroused by someone else, identify it in your mind. This is dopamine talking. This is the dope. This is the same kind. Matter of fact, it's really fascinating is that dopamine is that same rush that people on drugs get. So you're really getting doped when you actually have that dopamine rush. And it's easy to get totally lost in the feeling, but it will go away. It will die out. And there are people who spend their entire lives just chasing the dopamine rush in relationships. And they're with somebody for a year or two, maybe even 3. If they give it a chance, they try to constantly revivify the dopamine rush in the relationship, and all of a sudden they just give up and they go find the next person who gives them that dopamine high. And they become dope addicts. And it's all based upon that. But it doesn't lead to long-term sustaining relationships, and it doesn't lead to happiness because it actually keeps fading, and they never can grab a hold of it, and they keep looking for that first flush feeling that they have when they see someone who they're attracted to. They chase it and chase it and chase it, and it leads to all kinds of dissatisfaction and a lot of broken hearts along the way. So keep that in mind. Another thing that we actually have learned, one thing, well, I mean not learned, but we need to focus on is also just how the church deals with the divorced. The divorce has become a larger percentage of our church family, and we still have a problem in our churches is that we still have a high bias towards families, and it should be. I mean, young families need all the support, and they need to be connected. They need to have a church home that they feel totally comfortable with. But sometimes in the whole aspect of managing a body of believers, we have looked at divorcees as more on the fringe or the problems that we really just don't know how to deal with. So we just kind of leave them dangling on the edges. And I've talked to several divorced people who feel that way. They go to their church and it's just like they feel like they're aliens. So this is a big thing we have to worry about when it comes to divorcees. They're dealing with a lot of things. Basically, alienation and loneliness is one of the biggest things that actually hit them hard. Is that they go home at night when they had a family before, it's no longer there. Sometimes they have just a partial part of the family. One of them has the kids, and they don't have the extra support that they've had before. It leads to a lot of alienation and loneliness, and we've got to be aware of that. Another thing that we need to think about also is that many divorcees struggle with identity crisis. What this means is that when they were married, they were a couple, and they identified as a couple, and they had friends who were couples, and they had this couple mentality. But as their marriage dissolved, they found out that they became single again, and it's a big identity crisis. It actually becomes more of a problem for those who actually have children. And now that they were a strong nuclear family at one point, and then also now that they are single parents, sometimes even blended families where one or both partners get remarried, and this identity crisis can be very difficult to manage. And so we have to be very sensitive to that as a church. For the people who are divorced, is that they have a lot of things that are just really plaguing them, and we have to really kind of step up and help them out. And one thing that can really happen to a lot of divorcees is that depression can creep in. And depression is kind of an inner anger, which is, I don't like my situation, I'm frustrated with it, I don't have any hope. The positive feelings start to die out. They lack any kind of hedonic, expression. They just don't get any pleasure out of life. We have to be careful that we can be there for them during their crisis, because this can be a very dark time in their lives, and we have to be very careful and sensitive to what's going on. When you actually are at church, I want to remind you of an old tradition in the church that's really something that's been overlooked a lot lately. And I think it's really important for us to reconsider as a church, is that the idea of just greeting one another with a holy kiss. We have, and especially in North America, we have this idea that, any kind of physical touch would lead to kind of sexual arousal, and it shouldn't. Not every culture in the world has that problem, but it has been taught to us through our Victorian heritage, is that you just don't do those kinds of things. In the Bible, 6 times in the Bible it talks about greeting one another with a holy kiss in the New Testament. I think it's really important for us to consider the thoughts of this is that, for people who are divorced, people who are are even widowed, are single, that touch, the human touch, is a very powerful and important and healing thing for them. Sometimes just good is to give them a hug. It doesn't have to be anything weird and freaky and awkward, but we ought to maybe make it much more a part of how we greet each other, and just to make sure, especially those who do not have someone at home where they can get some kind of a human touch. It's amazing just how curative it is, and if we can be sensitive to their need for that, and just put your arm around someone and say, "Hey, I'm good to see you. How's your week?" It's amazing how much of a warmth and a flood of good things that can happen to someone who doesn't have that as a routine in their lives. So I think a church can learn from that. So how can we better administer to divorcees? This is the big question I think we still need to answer. I don't have the answers to it, but I think it's worthy of a discussion. And I encourage you, if you ever have opportunities to really think about this, is there things that we can do differently as a church to make sure that we can help them through a very difficult time? Divorce is not going to be a thing that's just going to magically disappear, and it will still be a part of us, but the more we contemplate these things, the more that we understand them, I think it will give us tools and be able to mitigate some of the stresses, and maybe even reverse some of the trends of where divorce is becoming more common than not. So we ought to pray very much about that. The verse I'd like to leave you with before we go is, "Love keeps no record of wrongs." 1 Corinthians 13:5. What a powerful passage. It's such a, oh, wow. This is what true agape love is. This is the gift love, is that when people hurt us and injure us, we are very quick to forgive. We are very quick to hope. And so just chew on that this week. What can that verse do for your relationship when with your spouse or with people that you know? That just keep no record of wrongs. Let those things just roll right off of you, because you let them fester in your life, you become bitter, and you'll find that your heart will harden. That's what it really means, where you start to think very skeptically of other people. So, thank you very much. Plan for the upcoming week. We will just think about these things. We hope it's been a good time for you. Next week we'll be talking about marriage and romance, so we'll look forward to that. Thank you.